Welcome to the And She Looked Up Creative Hour podcast with Lisa Bolton and Melissa Hartfield. We're two women who are artists and entrepreneurs, and yes, those two things can go together. This podcast is for the artists, the creators, and the makers who want to find a way to make a living creating what they love.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 14 of the And She Looked Up Creative Hour podcast. I'm Melissa, and as always, I'm here with my lovely co-host, Lisa. How are you doing today, Lisa?
I'm fantastic, thank you.
Excellent. And we are covering a really big topic today. Today we are talking about pricing your work. And before we dive in, because this is going to be a meaty one, and we're actually really excited to talk about this, but before we dive in, I just want to give a little disclaimer that if you are looking for the magic formula on how to price your work, that's not going to happen here because there isn't one. What we are going to be talking about today is all the different aspects of pricing your work. It is one of the hardest things that you will do in your business, and it is one of the most ongoing things that you will do in your business. And on the surface, it sounds like it should be so simple. The cost of what you're producing, plus a little built in for profit, and there's your price. But unfortunately, there's so many variables. It could be anything from the type of services that you have, the market that you're in, the industry that you're in, where you live, who your target customer is, what your expertise level is. Those all impact your pricing. And then, if that weren't enough, there's a lot of mental obstacles that go into pricing. Everything from your mental blocks around money, or if you have issues with imposter syndrome, or you worry about the opinion of your peers. And then there's questions like, should you discount? Should you not discount? Should you work for free? There's a lot. So we're going to dive into this today. And we thought it would be a helpful idea if we, first of all, give you a little bit about our experience with pricing, because I think between the two of us, Lisa and I have covered a lot of different aspects of pricing over the years. And then we're going to dive into just a little finance lesson on the different things you have to be aware of when you're pricing your work so that you actually do make money. So, Lisa, you've done a lot of pricing over your time working for yourself. What are the kinds of things that you have had to price out?
Okay, well, I have done a lot of pricing. I actually think the only thing I've never priced on my own is an actual physical product, because I've never technically sold. I wrote a book, but that was really market driven, and I can even talk a little bit about that because I was involved in the pricing discussions and where that sat. But for the most part, I've consistently priced my service or intangible services. So those are sort of where my experience lies. For me, when I first started out working for myself, the first question I got asked as it relates to pricing was buying my photography. And that was a real shock for me the first time I was asked if someone wanted to purchase my picture, because right away I thought, yes, absolutely, you can have it for free. Like, I didn't even I was just so excited that somebody liked what I was doing. So that was my first experience. And I'm sure, like so many, I look back now and can think of all the mistakes I made when I was trying to figure out what to charge for my work. With photography, it's really tricky because it's not just about the picture itself. And it's not even like in the years past where a photographer would come and even sell you like a physical print that you would hang on your walls. This is all about digital use. So this is, what is the photo going to be used for? How long is it going to be used for? What are the different ways that it can be used? Who's allowed to use it? Can it be sublet out to a different organization or partner than the person that's buying your photo? Like, there's so many nuances to it. And only over time did I start to pay attention and figure out those little nuances to what it meant to sell a photograph. And the biggest lesson for me was, once I was like, often kind of what we talked about even in previous episodes, was like, get yourself a template, do the math, and figure it out. And then you can just apply it going forward, and it becomes so much easier going forward. But you were bang on when you said that there's so much intangible stuff tied up in it. So like self-worth and value. And, this is your heart and soul. This is something so personal you're putting out there. And now someone's asking for a dollar value attached to it. And sometimes it feels icky, and there's all of that. And then there's like, well, this costs me money to do. There's just the math, which is the part that I love the most. But there's just the math involved in trying to figure out a price that truly reflected what that picture cost me. So that was sort of my first intro into it. And then from there, as I got into recipe development and writing, then became all of the service-based fees that I had to charge. So people started requesting my services to do everything from create a recipe, photograph a recipe, style food and shoot it, be on set. So some of those same things, but being on set to do those services. And that eventually evolved into actual pseudo catering jobs. So when I was doing a lot of the cheese boards and everything, I was being asked for, what would you charge to make a board for my party? What would you be charged to do an entire table? And it gets very complicated, and it can be very frustrating if you don't set up a system early on in your process to figure out what your number is. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what anybody else is necessarily willing to pay for it. It's what you need to charge for it. And we'll go into all the sort of nuances of that. But I would say that was sort of my intro, went right from my very first photograph that I sold all the way through all the different kinds of services that I did digitally and then also in person.
That's a lot. And you touched on some really good points there, especially the one like you're walking this fine balance between what people will pay and what you need to charge to make it sustainable. That's a big tightrope that a lot of us have to walk. And unfortunately, you have to revisit your pricing every year. Even if you only sell one product or one service, you need to revisit that price all the time because market forces change, costs change, all those things change. So you just never really get away from pricing.
It's an absolute constant. Yes.
It really doesn't get any easier. I started my career in bricks and mortar retail. So my first experience with pricing was pricing product. It was not product that I was creating, though. It was product that I was purchasing and then reselling. So I was purchasing it wholesale and reselling it on a store shelf. And that was very interesting working retail because I learned a lot about loss leaders, which is when a store puts something usually on the front page of a flyer or a circular, and it's sold at less than cost with the idea to bring people into the store, to bring traffic in, and just learning so much about different margins for different categories. Some categories make 50%, others make 2%. Learning how to balance that and how to price things to cover off the costs of running a store, which includes employees. And I worked in a drugstore. So we were also paying pharmacists who are professionals. They make a professional level salary. So that was my crash intro into pricing. And then since then, I've moved on to pricing my own services. So whether it's my graphic design or coaching or VA services, I also make my own products, which I sell on my Etsy shop. So I go through the handmade manufacturing process. And then through FBC, we run events. So I have a lot of experience with pricing events and pricing sponsorships and ticket sales and all those kinds of things, as well as digital products that we sell and doing sponsored content, which I know you have a lot of experience with too.
Yeah, that's right.
So sponsored content that we produce for a brand, this is sort of in the influencer marketing realm. I hate that term, but we're going to use it because most people know what it means. But also we manage campaigns for brands who want to work with bloggers. So we also price those services. So between the two of us, we've had a lot of experience pricing things. And what I can tell you is that after 10 years of all this different types of pricing, plus my 5 years back when I worked frontline retail, it really doesn't get any easier. And every time you price something new that's new to you, is a whole new learning curve that you have to go through because every industry is different and every industry has its little quirks and just sort of figuring out like, what am I doing here? So I think one of the best places to start, and I'm going to let Lisa tackle this because she's more of a finance person than I am, but it's just to talk about the basics, like understanding the basic terms when you're pricing your work, things like what your cost of doing business is, your cost of your goods and your cost of doing business, and gross margin and gross profit dollars, and what goes into all of those things to help you come up with that end number that you're going to present to the public.
Yeah. And you could do an entire hours a workshop on just all of the nuances of the finance of selling one single product or service. So there's a lot to it, but I think the biggest mistake I see people in terms of the way they talk about it is they will look over at a business over there and say, well, they're in business and they're charging X. And I think what's really key is that pricing is deeply personal. And so when we're talking about what your pricing, just because a business is open doesn't mean they're making money. When I was in commercial banking, I did a lot of lending to truck drivers that would get large contracts to deliver for large warehouse companies. We're going to, I don't want to use anybody's name, but we'll call it ABC is a big warehouse grocery store. And so if one of my clients would land a job for them, they would be so excited because the contract would be $1 million contract to run, a product for this organization. But what my client often didn't figure out is that it's going to cost them $1.1 million to execute the contract. But you get so excited about that top number, about the revenue number, that we'd forget to look at all the little costs that come into play. And so that's one of the biggest mistakes I see people making, is that they're really, especially when you have a product where you have an actual widget where you're savvy enough to understand that, I know that it costs me $10 to make my widget, so I'm going to sell it for $20 and we're good to go. I just think it's something that you have to get a little bit more granular at if you truly want to be profitable in the long run. When it comes to setting your price, you kind of have to start at the bottom. And the easiest way to do that is really to look at the costs that you have that are physical, tangible, that you literally have a receipt for. So I know that if I'm going to bake a cake, there's X amount of inputs. I can literally figure out the cost of that cake based on a percent. My bag of flour costs X. I know it takes a couple cups. I can figure it right out to, this is what the cost of the materials going into my product. So quite often that's referred to as your cost of goods sold if you're talking accounting terms, but that's like one of the physical costs that goes into my cake that I'm selling. This could be a sticker that you make. This could be a dress that you make, a painting that you do, whatever it is, but you're keeping track of the real tangible assets. And that's a very important part. And that's pretty understandable for people. Beyond that pricing then comes the intangible stuff. And the most common one to that is really your time. So this is where, from the moment you take that first phone call that says, yes, I'm going to enter into that contract with you, or yes, I'm going to sell you that good, what are all the steps involved? Because there's steps involved in going out to get and source your inputs. There's going to be costs, your time involved in making your inputs. And you have to start to evaluate the cost of your time in doing those things. So there's a whole bunch of different pieces that can come together in that. But at the end of the day, your revenue line isn't the number to get excited about, how many widgets you sell, because that's exciting. But I can tell you that I'd way rather see my profit line be the bigger number. So, and I kind of want to talk about premium pricing if down the road. Remind me, I've got it written down, because I've really taken to this, and I do think there's a big movement toward that. But the revenue number, while important, what you really want to be doing is making the number after you've taken your expenses away. That's the number you want to be working on. I would be very excited about bringing my expenses down and bringing that profit margin up.
And this is something that I know in the food blogging world, a lot of people don't do this.
Mm-hmm. Because it's not even just your time. Like beyond that, this is where it gets deeply personal. It's your lifestyle. Then it becomes about covering your time isn't profit. And I feel like sometimes that gets lost in it. So your time is a cost. It's an hourly wage, and whatever you choose to bill yourself out, or whatever you feel that time is worth, that's personal, but that's not profit. So profit is beyond that. It's to maintain the lifestyle you want to maintain. It's to grow your business down the road so that you can have something to invest back into your business, or invest into the education, or do product development. Like that's where profit becomes important, but it's not simply adding the cost of your time.
Yes. And a really good way to think about this, and the earlier you start thinking about this, the better it is for your business, is to think about what it would cost you to hire employees to do all the things that you're doing for free in your business. That's just sweat equity, right? Like if you had to hire somebody to go out and chase leads for you, or if you had to hire somebody to execute this section of the project, or what happens if you get big enough one day that you are no longer able to do all the work yourself and you need to hire clones of you, like what would you have to pay them? And this is a conversation that we have had in my other business surrounding our events, whether or not it's profitable to run an event. And we do make money from our events, but if we had to hire somebody, if for some reason the two of us were not able to run the event and we had to hire somebody, the profit we make would basically pay that person's salary. To me, that's not profitable. That is just breaking even. And this is, I think people hear all this, especially in the digital content world, this whole thing about 6-figure launches. Oh, have a course. You'll have a 6-figure launch and you'll make all this money. And what people don't understand is that 6 figures is gross revenue. That's the amount that they take in before any expenses are deducted from that. And I'm willing to bet there's a lot of 6-figure launches out there that only make a few dollars. There's other intangibles you have to think of besides your time. I think you also have to think about expenses that when you work from home, maybe you don't necessarily consider, like rent, internet access, utilities, your equipment. As a recipe developer, you need a stove, you need a microwave, you need a fridge, you need all those capital cost pieces of equipment.
Even if you break it down into fixed and variable costs, like that's something that people can usually relate to. So a variable cost being something that changes with how many widgets you sell or how many hours of service you sell. And the fixed cost being that if you still sell nothing, you still incur that cost. And if you can break that out when you're working and doing your own books, we talk about outsourcing bookkeeping, but this is something you should have a good handle on in-house as well, is really looking at both your fixed costs and your variable costs. And you're exactly right. Costs like keeping the lights on and the internet on and the rent paid, those are fixed costs that have to be factored in no matter how many widgets you sell.
That's right. And when you work from home, it's very easy to sort of overlook those costs. But if for any reason something happened to your home, let's say, you're going through a kitchen reno or something a little more catastrophic where a pipe bursts or a fire or a flood or any of those things where suddenly you are in a position where you have to rent space. Suddenly that's a cost you should have been factoring in the whole way, but you weren't because it was your house.
Yeah. Taking it for granted.
Yeah. And it's the same if you run an Etsy shop out of your garage. What if suddenly you don't have your garage anymore, but you've got all this product that you need to put somewhere? Like maybe you need to rent storage space. Just because you don't maybe pay outright out of pocket or it's included in your household expenses doesn't mean it's not a cost of doing your business. And you have to think about those things too, especially if you ever decide you want to sell your business. Those are all things that you have to think about, but you need to include them in your pricing. And then there's this whole other set of intangibles that we tend to forget about, like holiday pay, sick pay, health and dental benefits, all those things that when you work for somebody else, they're built into your compensation package, right? If you can't go to work one day, you still get paid. If you go on vacation for 2 weeks, you still get paid. In Canada, we don't have to pay for our medical, but we do have to pay for extended medical and we do have to pay for our dental. And that can be very expensive. I know because I have a $5,000 tooth, but it's like, that I didn't have dental benefits to pay for. And as you get bigger, it's things like insurance. So those are all intangible costs to running your business that eat into that revenue that you're collecting.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's part of when you're looking at your suite of products, and you touched on that earlier when you talked about having loss leaders and having, free products and so forth. And then you have the more expensive products per se. Expensive doesn't mean it's more profitable. If you're someone who has a multiple product line or service line, each product or service is going to have its own margin on it. So there's going to be some things that you sell that you make nothing on. Quite often in our space, those are lead magnets, and those are things that you've put out there that you're selling maybe for $1, or it's a free download, or something that it's just in order to, as part of a marketing or acquisition strategy.
If you have a blog, that's a loss leader. You are using it to draw people into you. It's a marketing expense.
Exactly. And it costs money to keep those things going. And you're going to have all sorts of products that depending on your business, you're going to determine which are your leaders and which are your losers, or maybe they're just strictly customer acquisition tools. So this is an exercise on sort of across all your business that you're going to have to really work this out between all your products and services that you sell. It's an important number to know.
Before you even start pricing your products or your services, you really have to have an idea of what your costs are just to run your business, just to keep the lights on. And those are all those things that we just talked about, like your rent, your internet access, your hosting fees, all those things. You need to cover those every month as well, right? So that all has to be built into that margin or markup that you're going to put on top of the cost of actually making that product or providing that service. So as you can see, that big profit amount that you think you're making really starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller.
A good exercise if you work from home is to, from your revenue that you're making, go through your personal budget items. You'll be surprised at what you might miss, but that would be a good exercise. And take a percentage, even if it's 10%, 15% of those household items or those personal living items, and start taking percentages of those costs and taking them off the profit that you think you're earning from your product. And that'll be very eye-opening to you as well as you're planning going forward.
Yeah, that's a good exercise to go through as well, just for tax time, because there are a lot of pieces of running your business from home that you are able to deduct at tax time, including things like your office space. And it's usually done on a percentage of your square footage, but you can deduct a portion of your utilities and a few other things. So it's just a really good idea to start tracking those from the get-go.
And one other quick finance term, and I don't want to get too financy, but it's important to remember that a write-off is not free. A write-off is an expense.
They just write it off. Seinfeld episode. Do you know what a write-off is?
And it's true, but there is a bit of a misconception, I think, that becoming self-employed, all of a sudden everything in life becomes, 40% cheaper. And that's only the case if you're making the profit to support that. Just because you're self-employed, if your business is still losing money or you're breaking even, that doesn't mean that those lunches or that vacation is free, because you can write it off as a business expense. So there's just some simple terminology, but remember that a write-off is still an expense.
It's still an expense. And keep in mind that there are a lot of things, depending on where you pay taxes, are not 100% write-off or deduction, right? Things like when you go out for a meal with a client, you don't get to write off your part of the meal. You only get to write off the client's part of the meal, because you're entertaining them. You would have had to eat anyway.
And it all depends on where your jurisdiction is and everything.
Yes, absolutely. This is where an accountant can be so helpful. This is where I really recommend going to an accountant before you even start. That was the first thing I did the day after I started working from home, was go sit down with an accountant for half an hour and just understand all the things I could and couldn't do and what the ramifications of those things would be. This is where they can point out to you, no, you don't get to deduct 100% of this. You only get to deduct 20% or 40% or whatever. And it's going to vary from province to province, country to country, state to state. But that's another thing you're going to have to pay for, professional fees like accountants and lawyers.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're not cheap. So those are all the pieces that you have to be aware of before you dive into actually pricing your work. So when I said there wasn't a magic formula, there is not a magic formula, but there are formulas out there that can help you calculate what your expenses will be, and how to factor in things like holiday pay, health benefits, sick pay, vacation day, and based on how many days and how many hours a year or month you want to work. So there are formulas out there that can help you get a sense of where you should be depending on how much you want to earn in a year.
Yeah.
And another big thing to remember is taxes. So when you work for yourself, your employer is not deducting taxes for you. You are the employer. So it's very important that whenever you bring money in, that you set aside, actually the recommended number is around 30%. But again, talk to your accountant. They might have a more refined number based on your circumstances that you have to set aside. Every invoice that gets paid, you got to put that money in a bank account because you're going to have to send it to the government. And you don't want a nasty surprise at the end of the year where you owe and you didn't put that money aside. And that happens to a lot of very smart people. That's another thing to remember when you sit there and go, oh man, I'm charging $100 an hour right off the top. $30 is of that $100 is going into a bank account to pay taxes.
No, that's really good. It's true. You have to get organized and go through all of this stuff. It's not the fun stuff. It's not the sexy stuff, but it definitely will pay itself in dividends down the road when you actually start selling things and you know at least what your bottom line is. And then from there, you've got a lot of fun and flexibility, but you need to know what you need to be selling your stuff at to cover your costs.
And then there's this whole thing of when you enter into a new industry, for lack of a better word, is just understanding how that industry works from a pricing perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow the rules, but you do have to know the rules. That can be tricky when you're a newbie. It can kind of feel like everybody knows the answer except you. Mm. And it can be very intimidating to ask because often the people you are asking are people that you are competing with in some shape or form. You don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing, but at the same time, you need advice, you need help, you just need to be pointed in the right direction. You don't always know the right questions to ask. So that can be really challenging when you're first starting out.
Very much so, because I remember growing up, we never talked about money as a family. We didn't talk about how much mom or dad made or what expenses were. Like, we were just always told it was very private, and that's how I was raised. And I think there's different schools of thought on that, but money has a very emotional draw when you're talking to people about it. It can often, especially I think when you're creative, be tied to not your worth, but a perceived worth. It can be, there's this feeling that this is my heart and soul. And I think this whole idea of like seller's guilt is real. Like, what do I sell this for? I don't know. And I think it's everything from, gosh, what will they say if I try to sell it for $10? And oh my gosh, will they think that's cheap? Will they think that's expensive? My work's not good enough, or my work's better than that. No one will pay that much, or they're going to order, a customer's going to say, well, that's cheap. I'll take 27. I think there's so many different emotions tied to that it can be very difficult to compartmentalize that piece, put it aside, and just look at the numbers to know what makes sense, because the outside noise doesn't matter when it comes to pricing. I really feel strongly about that, and I've been in enough different groups to know that people that are, it's funny how groups work, people that are in the same space that, to your point, are competitors and yet comrades, because they do want to support each other, I think, genuinely and authentically. But then when it comes to talking about money, it's like the gloves come off and everybody has the right answer. And they will tell you exactly what you should or shouldn't be charging and if it's too much or too little. But they don't know your cost structure, just like you don't know theirs. And so it's an incredibly personal decision.
It is a personal decision. And I think, too, sometimes, how am I trying to say this? Oh, now it's gone from my head.
I sometimes liken it to the blackjack table when, if you've ever played blackjack, there's like a position spot. And as a dealer is going around the table, if a certain, let's just say, I don't know, there's a 6 turned over by the dealer, obviously trying to make 21. Everyone, like seasoned jackpot players will tell you the odds say don't hit. But you know what? You can hit if you want to hit. But I've been at tables where in the past, there's been someone who's the last position before the dealer flips their card, and that person says, oh, I'm going to hit. And they take the quote-unquote bust card, and everybody growls and says, you're messing it up for everybody by making that decision. And you know what? No, they're not. They're doing what worked for them in that moment. And sometimes I find that we can get into these discussions with, well, you shouldn't be doing your work for free, or you're driving the price down, or you shouldn't be charging this, and you're charging too much. And I think that's the part that I wish that people could turn a little bit inward on. And it's great to collaborate with other people. And I absolutely believe in soliciting input. And I think it's a very fair question to go out to peers and say, what are people charging these days for this or that? But you have to take that information as strictly that. It's just information, and then you need to take it home and do what works for you. But I just don't feel like there's a real place for opinions in this space sometimes from others. I just feel like it's a little more black and white, or should be treated that way.
This drives me bonkers. I could go on a whole rant about this. I will try to refrain from doing so. But yes, there is always going to be that group of people who feels that their livelihood is being threatened by someone newer or someone less experienced coming in and charging less money. This is how I look at it. This is my analogy. Think of cars. When you go out to buy a car, your number one goal for that car is to get you from A to B safely without breaking down. That's the goal. Now, if that was the only goal, then there would be one car company out there making one car for one price. But there's so many other things that go into buying a car. Some people want something that is a status symbol because that's important to them. Other people don't give a crap about that. They just want the cheapest thing to get them from A to B, and they don't care what color it is, and it needs 4 wheels and seats, right? And then you have other people who want something that's got a little more space because they've got kids or they're hauling sports equipment around, or you have somebody who needs a truck because they're in trades or construction and they need to haul equipment and supplies around. Like, there's so many different variables into buying that car. The $20,000 car over here is still going to get you A to B just as good as the $70,000 SUV over here. They both do the same thing, but they're different, and there's room for those differences. That's why there's so many cars out there to buy, and that's even within a model of a car. I drive a RAV4. When I bought my RAV4, there were 6 different models in the RAV4 lineup, all with a different price point, right? Same car, just some of them had little extras. And that's a good thing to look at too, is that's a way that you can tier your pricing, is you start with a base model, but then you add on different extras at each level. Same thing, but you get a little bit extra stuff for a little bit more money. All that to say is that there is room for everyone. There is room for the budget item. There is room for the luxury item. There is room for the specific to a certain type of job level. Like there's room for all of us. And you should never let somebody make you feel you are destroying an industry because of your pricing mechanism.
Yeah.
And this, I think, can be really disheartening to a lot of people when they're starting out, is feeling shamed about their pricing. And I don't like to see people shaming other people about their pricing. Everyone's financial situation is different. And for some people, charging that $100 might be the difference between them making rent or not. You might be charging $500 for the same thing. But if somebody's got kids to feed and rent to pay and no money coming in, that $100 could mean an awful lot to them. And we've all done things like that when we start out. And sometimes even long after we start out, where you just need the revenue because you have bills to pay.
It comes down to mind your own business. I really think that do what works for you at that point in time. And there's a lot of strategies to increase your prices down the road if you're feeling worried about setting the bar low and then having to negotiate through raising prices with your customers. There's very well proven strategies on how you can do that. So that's not something you need to be concerned about. So I think if you are just entering the world of sort of creating on your own, and you feel like you need to keep your prices low just to get your feet wet and get started and get some traction and have some customer experience under your belt. Sometimes that's the easiest way to do it, is to just start with some low-priced products to get customers in the door and then to start understanding your own workflow. So there's a lot of valid reasons to start out at a low price point if that's what you need. I'm equally a fan of premium pricing as well, but I do think that no matter where you land, it's just best to mind your own business.
Yeah, absolutely. It is not uncommon in the visual arts for people to work for no money, or to work on spec, which is another thing we can talk about, or to work at a very low rate simply to build up their portfolio, because they need that portfolio to land those bigger jobs. And it's just, you can call it paying your dues or whatever you want to call it, but it's nothing to be ashamed of, and there's nothing wrong with it. And you're not going to be there forever. And if you can start out in your career charging those top dollars, like, good for you, go for it. But don't feel badly if you can't. So when you're starting out, we referenced this in a previous episode where we talked a little bit about tracking your time. This is where tracking your time can be really useful, because it really does give you a sense of how long it takes you to do these tasks that you do, whether it's making an item, or whether it is providing a service to somebody. Even services like, say, a coaching service where you charge by the hour. So perhaps you have an hour-long phone call and you charge a rate for that for the session. The work that you do for that session is not going to just be an hour. You're going to do your prep work and your follow-up work. Those are things that you need to track because you need to build that into your hourly rate. Even though you're only charging the customer for an hour, it's going to take up more than an hour of your time. So that's where tracking your time can become very useful. And it's also useful as you progress and you become more efficient and better at what you do. You'll notice that it takes you less time to do things.
I'm a big fan of as you relate to pricing by the hour. If possible, I would encourage people, especially if you do coaching packages or any sort of hourly services, to see if you can figure out a way to also charge by the service where possible. And the reason I say that is because I do think there is a psychological piece that comes between you and a client when you are charging by the hour versus by the service. And I think if you're doing, say, design work or creative work for somebody, you're kind of starting at opposing sides so that the client is going to want something done in the least amount of hours as possible. And essentially you want to bill as many hours as possible. And it can be a bit passively combative in that you're both kind of have different objectives. And so if you do have hourly priced service model or a product design model, I think it's a worthwhile exercise to model out what that might look like priced per service. So if you found that there's becomes a rhythm to the hourly service you provide, if you can swap that over to an experiential one price model, there's a lot of benefits in that in terms of breaking out your margin, but there's also a lot of benefits in that into the client experience, because now you and the client have a common path and a common objective. You're both there to get to that, better end state of whatever it is they've hired you to do in the most efficient way possible. So if you do have an hourly service, I just suggest it's a worthwhile exercise to consider if you'd be better served from a pricing point of moving that over to a price per service model.
Yes. And so this is where I was going to go next, is that hourly rates are tricky because when you're starting out, it's probably going to take you longer to do something. Should your client have to pay for that because you're inexperienced? Probably not. But then as you become more experienced and more efficient, it takes you less time. Should your client pay less because you're really good at what you do? It's important to know how long it takes you to do things. And I do think it's important to have an hourly rate in your head of how much your time is worth. But I'm a big fan of project, especially in the kind of work that I do, in project pricing.
Yes, that's better. Yeah.
So where you are taking the entire project and you're putting it at a price point. The client never has to know your hourly rate.
No.
And actually, quite often when people will ask me for my hourly rate, I just say that I price on a project by project basis, depending on what needs to be done. And this is where you can throw things in, as you were referring to make it more experiential, where you can throw add-ons that don't necessarily cost you anything or cost you very little, but they're very valuable to the client. And this is where you can really bulk up or beef up your pricing. And this is where, we'll talk about premium pricing in a minute, because I'm a big fan of that too. This is where you can lead yourself down the path to having a premium service or to doing premium pricing for certain aspects of whatever it is you provide.
Yeah, because you can add price to things that have nothing to do with the design, but everything to do with the emotional experience of the client or the experience they have dealing with you from front end to back end. There's so many things you can add to your price, to that experience, that will allow you to improve your profit margin on that particular project.
Yeah, and you can also do what is known as a la carte pricing. This is very common in the photography world. We also use it a lot with FBC, where you have a base package price that you charge that covers off the basic services of whatever the client wants. And usually that's priced at a market fair price. So it's competitive. You might be higher, you might be a little bit lower, but you're competitive with your peers. So if you're a luxury photographer, like a luxury wedding photographer, obviously your peers are also going to be luxury wedding photographers, not bargain wedding photographers, right? But you can also offer add-ons to that package that all have individual price point, or you can have a premium package where all those add-ons are included for a very large amount. So it gives clients some flexibility. They can pay for that more basic package and just add on a few a la carte items that they want, Or you will have clients who are like, I want the whole thing. And they pay that premium price. The premium price would probably be a little bit less than if they purchased all the a la carte items separately.
And that strategy is really good if you started low and you need to raise your prices. That's a good strategy to have. It's a little bit more of a discreet way to raise your prices. Some people fall into that where they've offered a course or a workshop or something and it's always been at this price and they want to up it. Having those add-ons is a way to do that in a way that's still transparent to the customer, but it kind of justifies your price increase in a more positive way to your end client.
And some of those a la carte items or add-on items can be things that don't cost you very much money at all, but that have tremendous value to the client, like we mentioned. I remember a few years ago, we were working on a brand campaign, and one of the bloggers who participated, inadvertently shot the recipe using old packaging of the product because she purchased the product regularly, and that's what that was what she had in her cupboard. She had the new packaging that had been sent to her, but she had used the old product in her cupboard because it was already open. She was so embarrassed that she had done this, and she apologized and she offered to reshoot the recipe with the new packaging as she should have. But then what she did is she tossed in some extras for the brand at no charge. And these were things like additional social media mentions, I think an insert into her newsletter, all things that had a lot of value to the brand, but that really didn't take much effort on her part as a way to say, I'm sorry. And so it's always good to have a list of those types of things in your back pocket that you can pull out when you do need to maybe tempt a brand new customer, or when you are looking to add, like, where can I add on a little bit of extra income? It's always good to have a few things that maybe are very easy for you or don't take much time. And this is something to keep in mind, is that value and price are two different things. Mm-hmm. What you price something at may not necessarily reflect the value that it means to your customer, or vice versa. So that's something to always keep in mind. Is a lot of people who are very nervous about pricing high because it's something that's easy for them to produce. They're like, well, it only takes me 10 minutes to do that, or whatever. They feel very nervous about pricing it high because it's easy for them to do. But what matters is what value that thing that you are producing or providing has to your customer or client. And this is something that can be really difficult to wrap your head around, especially if you have imposter syndrome or money block issues.
Yes, I agree. And you know what the best way I found, because I incurred this a lot when I was making boards. So when I was doing up, especially large, kind of complicated cheese boards that were very easy for me. So I would always think, like, why would anybody pay hundreds of dollars for this? When for me, I'm like, it's just something that I do. It was hard for me to articulate how I did it. It was just something that sort of came naturally to me. I'd practiced at it. But I had heard once, and it really resonated with me, is when you're thinking about pricing your work, remember that you are not your avatar. So you are not your client. Of course, you wouldn't pay $500 for a cheese board because it's easy for you. And if you can remember that and think about the things that you would pay $500 for and kind of try to put yourself in that position, it'll help you get over that hump of no one's ever going to pay this for my product or service, because you're not the one that's buying your product or service because it's easy for you. Of course you wouldn't pay for that. Right. And I think if you can think of it that way, it'll help you get over that, any sort of hesitation to maybe get into a premium brand place, if that's sort of where you're looking for. Because I will tell you this, one thing I realized early on is that my offering, whatever I was doing, whether I was teaching or selling a book or whatever, it's a constant. People are a variable. And if you can make the same or more money selling less products and therefore possibly dealing with less variable components, being human beings, the better off you're going to be, because humans complain and they have questions and they want redos and remakes and they want edits and they have more questions and sometimes they don't pay you. And humans, there's a lot to dealing with humans. And I think that I've become a fan knowing that I would rather have a more intimate relationship with a smaller amount of clients than have a large no relationship with a whole bunch of clients in the type of work that I do. Now, I don't know, I'm going to date myself, and this is probably 20 years ago. I don't know if anyone recalls, but there used to be kiosks in airports and malls where they sold $10 watches. And this came out of a woman had started it literally out of her apartment, and she found a way to bring in watches. And for $10, you could get like a cute watch and an extra battery. And that was someone who was not premium pricing. That was not someone looking to have a relationship with their customers. This was a woman who's like, I'm going to sell 1 million of these because I'm selling a commodity. I'm not selling an experience. And that's a great spot for value pricing. But if you're doing creative work that has emotion involved, a human element that is very personal, getting comfortable moving into that premium place can be very beneficial as it relates to efficiency, profitability, growth opportunities. If you can find a way to get over any mental blocks to get yourself there, I definitely think it's something worth considering.
And sometimes the only way to get yourself through those blocks is just to go through the client, customer, product, sales scenario many times. One of the best things for me starting out was that I did a lot of work because it was work, because I was getting paid to do it. And I needed to build up a client base. I needed to get experience, and I needed to build my portfolio. So I did a lot of different things. And what I learned from that process, things I love to do, and I could do them all day long. And there's other things that I really don't like to do. And if somebody wants me to do those things, they're going to have to pay me an awful lot of money. Going through that process really taught me a lot, because it taught me, first of all, the things that were just going to come right off my service offering. Like, I'm just not going to offer them anymore because I just don't enjoy doing them, no matter how much I'm getting paid. And then there were other things that I would keep on, but that I would price at an extremely high price point, like the very top end of what I thought they were worth. And if somebody came along and wanted to pay that, and by the way, sometimes they do, I would do it. And then I had my other services that were priced competitively for the group that I was in. So I didn't feel like I was pricing too high, and I didn't feel like I was pricing too low. And those were my bread and butter. But going through that whole process of doing a whole bunch of different things, and you learn very quickly what your time is worth for certain tasks. And that's a really good exercise to have to go through.
It's true. It's a real lesson in slowing down your sales process. So when a client approaches you, don't be quick to label a price on that project and get back to them that fast. You need to understand the client's needs. You understand the scope of the project, the timing of the project. There's a reason there's premium pricing on rush deliveries of things. Like, if somebody comes to you with an opportunity, be quick on your response. If you're interested, be quick getting back to your client with I'm super excited to, explore this opportunity with you. Let's get some details on the table. And then take the time you need to make sure you're pricing that right, because it could be a long-term relationship that's going to make it difficult if you undercut yourself to move out of. And you need to fully understand the scope of the project, because if it has a lot of those components that are not the fun things, the things you like to do, or the things that really bring you joy and the reason why you got into business for yourself in the first place, you may want to price yourself right out of the market. And I know I've done that on certain jobs where I've put price tags on things that I thought there's no way they're going to pay that. And if they did, well, I guess I would do it because the margins would be worth it. But sometimes you just want to price yourself out of the work. You shouldn't be booking 100% of the jobs that you get asked to do. If you're doing that, your prices are too low. So you should expect to be seeing a decline rate, and whether that's 50%, 30%, 10%, it kind of depends on the industry you're in. But if you're booking 100% of the jobs that you put out there, you've got to raise your prices.
There is also something to be said about pricing yourself too low. There are people, when they hear your number, and they compare it to the other numbers they've been quoted, and you are anywhere from 10 to 50% lower, they're like, yeah, maybe this person doesn't know what they're doing, or maybe they're not very good, and you don't get considered for the job. I actually remember the very first product photography job that I landed. So embarrassing, but I'm going to tell the story anyway. I was on a conference call with the marketing and creative team for this product, and they had given me all the deliverables and asked me for a quote. And I had never quoted on a product photography gig before. I was very comfortable shooting lifestyle photography for food, but actually shooting food product, which is a whole different ballgame. We were on this call and I had to give a number, and I said $700. thinking that like that was like the biggest number I could think of. Right? The head of marketing on the other end said, right, so $1,700. Okay. And I was like, oh, he didn't hear me right. And I said, no, I said $700. And he's like, yeah, I know, but I think you meant 1,700. And I was horrified because I was obviously way too low. And I'm very lucky that this person obviously felt I was the right person for the job and they wanted me, but they were like, very nicely telling me like, you're underpricing yourself and this is what we have budgeted and this is what you're going to be paid. And I'm very grateful.
Oh, thank goodness for that person.
Yes. And over the scope of time and doing more projects of these, I realized that even the 1,700 was low.
Mm-hmm.
Like I should have been charging much more. But, when you're first starting out and you don't know, you're kind of just hoping you got it right. And a lot of times nobody's going to tell you. He could easily have been like $700. Yes.
Yeah.
Like sign up, right? Or he could have just been like, she doesn't know what she's doing. We don't want her. And I would never have known either way. This is such a fine line, right? You don't want to be too expensive. You don't want to be too cheap. You want to project the right pricing for the type of value and image that you are trying to present to the world and to the type of customer that you want, because the whole psychology of the customer who's purchasing, and that's a whole other ball game, right? There are people who want the best, the fanciest, the most expensive, because that's what's important to them. And then there's other people who do not feel good unless they've driven a bargain out of you. And this is why you have people who sit there and go, should I price this at $9.99 or should I price it at $10?
You can be all over the map. You're absolutely right.
This is something you have to have a bit of a sense of when you are starting your business or moving your business forward, is who is the client that you're going after. If you're entering into a luxury market with a luxury client, you're not going to be bargain pricing your work. That's just going to be a big mistake. But on the other hand, if you are aiming for high volume, low cost, budget market, maybe you do want to be inexpensive and just work on a volume.
When I did my book proposal, this was an area that I really dedicated time to. And I feel like that is what got me over the hump when it came to them understanding that I knew exactly who was going to buy my book. And if you haven't gone down this experience before, I highly recommend that you create those avatars, those customers, those pretend customers. And I went so far as to give them names. And I had 3 of them that I knew because they were different. You're going to have different types of people buying your products and for different reasons. And when I went through my book process and we were trying to land on a price for the book, I knew I wanted the book to be at a price that was an easy giftable price. I didn't want a $40 book. My book retailed at $24.95, which means most of the time you can get it for around $20. But I knew I wanted a price point that people didn't have to think that hard about, that it was like, oh, in fact, I'll take 2 because this would make a great gift. And I researched and developed and designed these characters and gave them names, these women that I said, this is age range, this is her income bracket, this is whether she's working or has kids, and these are the friends, and these are the places she shops, and these are the places. And like, I went through all this, and then I had a different individual that, was maybe a little more affluent and single and professional. And I knew that she was going to be buying my books as part of her business to give out as thank you gifts to her customers. And I really went deep. And once I had those crystal clear customers, it made everything else so much easier. I knew how to talk about my book. I knew where it would be best placed. I knew how to merchandise it. And I think that can apply for nearly any type of creative endeavor. If you can get in there, because then if you call her Mary and Mary is this type of person, what Mary would or would be not willing to pay for that. And that's going to give you so much clarity in nailing down your prices all through your product lines.
And you can do this for any industry, like any industry. If you're a blogger, who is the lady or the man or the kids or whoever coming to your website? What are they there for? How much money do they make? What's their biggest challenge? All those things can help you figure out not just your pricing, but like what kind of content are you going to produce? What kind of products are you going to put out there? Like what is going to make their life better from their point of view?
It's not what you would do or pay. You are not the avatar in most cases, and maybe you are, but I would say,
but
most cases, best to kind of think of people I went right into my social circle and thought, who are these people? Like, will any of my friends be buying this? And what do they look like? And get into their habits and and it really it brings clarity in a very murky world of pricing.
That's one of those things you should do right at the beginning. And it's also something you should do with every new product that you bring out. If you're selling products, whether they're physical products or digital products, it's like, who is going to buy this? Who am I making this for? And what kind of income do they have? What is a price point that they wouldn't think twice about? What is a price point that they would think twice about? Like, where's my wiggle room? Mm-hmm. But if you know who that person is, it makes all those decisions so much easier. It also makes your marketing strategy so much easier. Everything from the type of graphics you make is going to depend on the type of customer you have. There's a great book by Fiona Humberstone. She has this great book on branding yourself for small businesses. Brand Brilliance.
Okay.
Brand Brilliance. That's what it's called. And she goes through all the different types of customers and the kind of color choices you're going to make if you have a luxury customer versus a bargain customer or somebody who's in between and all that thing. I mean, there's so much psychology into making people that goes into making people buy, and pricing is just one part of that. The point being that all those pieces that go into making somebody buy have to mesh together. So your pricing, your image, the way your brand makes people feel, like those all contribute to how you're going to price your work.
Hey everyone, it's Lisa here. This was such a great conversation on pricing, and we really got into some great detail that we decided to split the episode into 2. So this is where we'll leave off today, and next week you can turn in for part 2 or episode 15 for the rest of the conversation on pricing. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us for the And She Looked Up Creative Hour. Be sure to check out the show notes for any links or resources we talked about in this episode. If you enjoyed the chat, please be sure to subscribe and you will automatically be notified when the new shows are released, and we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a review, tell us where you're listening from, or even just send a note to say hi. You can find us at andshelookedup.com or on Instagram under andshelookedup. Thanks so much for listening.